Welcome to this lesson 16 in our series on Rails. We've looked at Active Record and now we're going to look at Action View. Active Record was our means of looking at the models, and it was a Rails convention that enabled us to manipulate models. Now we're looking at Action View, and this is how we show our models to our users. So we use Action View and Action Controller, which all come under the term of Action Pack. And this follows a RESTful convention, which I'll explain further in our next slide. Action Pack is a Rails framework for handling and responding to web requests. So we see in our little diagram here that we have a request, then we route that to a controller and we interact with a model, and then the controller renders the correct view, which the user can then manipulate on the web page. So this is a very nice convention following the model view controller separation and enabling us to represent data on the screen. So we can, in order to look at this, we can do a bit of a cheat, because before we've been creating our models in separately, but we can actually use, we can create a new blog, our new app called Blog, and we can scaffold everything, which actually creates everything for us. So Rails G scaffold post, so we're creating a post with Action View, Action Controller, and Active Record for a post with a title, which is just a string. That's understood by Rails convention, and content, which will be text. So we then migrate that to the database, and we look at what scaffold does. Well, scaffold is quite a magical command which actually creates a migration, a model, and routes at a RESTful controller and views. So here with Action Pack, we're looking at routes and the RESTful controller and the views, but before we've looked at the migrations and the models. So the views can be represented, the data in the views can be represented with an ELB template or with a Haml template. These are two ways in which we can use Ruby in the views. So index.html.erb allows us to use these percentage signs in order to embed Ruby code, which is not seen by the user. And it also allows us to show Ruby, the results of Ruby code to the user through percentage equals. Haml makes this even more concise, but can sometimes be a bit more difficult to read. So just a dash represents the Ruby code, which isn't seen by the viewer, and an equals allows us to see the Ruby code and also to do Ruby operations. So Action Controller is a class, basically, which each of our controllers will inherit from, and it requires one or more actions. So actions are really responses to HTTP requests to perform a task. HTTP is really the kind of cement that allows the internet to work, and these requests are again conventions which we'll look at it when we do our RESTful actions. So after the action controller renders a view through a convention, unless we tell it to do otherwise. Now the actions are specified in the routes.rb file, which maps the URL request to the correct controller action. So let's look at this in more detail. So here, our scaffold has created resources posts, which actually is a convention that encapsulates all of these different actions. The conventions of resources allow us to index all resources, show a specific resource, destroy an existing resource. It also allows us to put a form on the page to create a new resource. It allows us to actually create a new resource. It also gives us a form to edit an existing resource and allows us to actually update the existing resource in the database. And we can see those actions in our post controller, which, as we said before, was inherited from application controller. So application controller is just a class in our Rails API, which our posts controller is inheriting from. So this is all being created by Rails scaffold. The before action we'll look at in a bit more detail in a later lesson. But here we have all of these different actions within the controller that are created for us. So we've got the HTTP request, get posts, or even a JSON format for that as well. And that is in index, so that is indexing all resources. Show, which is with the HTTP get command, shows a specific resource, so that would need an ID for that resource. New allows us to create a form for a new resource. Edit is actually editing, creating a form for an editing resource, and create an update. Create is actually the actual creation of a new resource within our database, and update is actually changing our resource within the database as well. And we've got destroy at the bottom, which is literally deleting the resource from the database. That's just a button, so we don't need a form for that. You just have a button which would then enable us to destroy that resource. So if we do rake routes in our app command line, we can see each of these actions which are mapped out for us. So we have a prefix which enables us, which we can refer to within our views. So posts path would enable us to go to posts index. We can also create a post. We can actually render the form for a new post, and we can edit a post. So index lists all of them. Show shows one. New is a form for creating. Create is a new record in the database. Edit is a form for updating, and update is updating a record in the database, and delete is destroying the record. So the URIs that the viewer would see in their web page are represented by URI pattern. The actions are each of the actions within the posts controller, and also we can see the prefixes which we can refer to in our views. The verbs are literally what HTTP verb that those each of those actions map to. So it's, this is quite a whirlwind session, and we'll look at some of these concepts in more detail in our next